All right, I'm glad you're here with us tonight. This is the first of what's going to be 4 sessions. Where are we in prophetic time? Well, I want to introduce to you tonight our speaker, Ted Van Landaghem. We are grateful for Ted being with us here tonight. I want to tell you just a few. This is really just a small bit of what he's done in the past and what he's doing now. So Ted has been formerly a Messianic pastor of a Messianic congregation. I think you've also pastored a non-Messianic congregation as well. He was the presenter for the Ancient Hebrew Scroll Project. For almost a decade, he was the spokesman for Maos Israel. That's Ari Sokaram's organization. Ted has been 26 years in the U.S. Air Force. He served in the Iraq War. He served in the Pentagon. He served in the White House under President George W. Bush. He is, more importantly, the father of 6 wonderful kids and the grandfather of 4 grandkids. Is that right? 4 grandkids. He is currently the director of synagogue and church engagement for the Messianic Jewish Alliance, that's MJAA, and the Joseph Project. Glad that he's here tonight. So I'm going to not take up any more of his time. I'm going to ask Ted if he would to come, and why don't y'all give him a hand as we get started tonight.
Well, good evening. Well, it's an honor to be here with you this evening. So tonight we're going to be talking, and over this weekend, where are we in prophetic time? We're going to endeavor to answer this question throughout this conference. And before we do that, we need to lay some foundation. And that foundation comes from the Word of God itself. The book of Ezekiel, chapter 11, says, "Thus says the Lord your God, I will gather you from all the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered. And I will give you the land of Israel. And when you come there, you will remove from it all the detestable things and its abominations. And I will give them one heart and a new spirit within them. And I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, a soft heart towards the Lord, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules and obey them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God." Now again, the Lord says this, he reiterates this again in Ezekiel 36. He says, "For I will take you out of the nations and gather you from the countries and bring you back into your own land, and I will sprinkle clean water on you. And you will be clean, and I will cleanse you from your impurities and from all your idols." You see, the Lord is going to return our people back to the land, and he has. But it's not just about returning us back to the land, it's about returning us back to our God. He wants us to return back to our God. And he's going to remove all of our idols. And he's going to give us a heart transplant, a new heart. He's going to take out the stone heart, the hard heart, and give us a fleshy heart, a soft heart towards the Lord. And he indeed is doing this just as he promised, because our God is a promise-keeping God. He goes on in Zephaniah chapter 3, and he says, "At that time I will bring you back, even at the time I gather you, for I will give you fame and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I return your captives before your eyes, says the Lord." Indeed, God has made Israel a fame among the nations. This tiny nation, the size of New Jersey, is an innovator in all kinds of technologies. The cell phone came to us from Israel, and so many other things. God has made the people of Israel a fame among the nations, just as he said he would, because he's a promise-keeping God. But he says in Amos chapter 9, that I will plant them in their land, and they shall never again be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. He's going to bring us back to the land and plant us like a tree in the land, and we're never going to be uprooted from that land ever again, because our God is a promise-keeping God. So I want to go through a series of what I call prophetic indicators, and there's 15 of them that I'm going to go over tonight. These aren't all the prophetic indicators, but ones that I wanted to highlight to you tonight. And one of these indicators that I see of God moving in prophetic time is the restoration of a dead language, and that dead language was Hebrew. There was a fella, his name was Eliezer ben Yehuda, born in 1858, lived in 1922, and he was the driving spirit and force behind the revival of the Hebrew language, the only language in all of humanity that has come back from the dead. God didn't just resurrect the nation, he resurrected the language of that nation ahead of its restoration. In 1881, Ben Yehuda immigrated to Israel that was then ruled by the Ottoman Turk Empire that had ruled that area for 500 years, and he settled in Jerusalem. Ben Yehuda regarded Hebrew and Zionism, the restoration of the Jewish people to their land, as symbiotic. He said that the Hebrew language can only live if we revive the nation and return the people to their land. So in 1908, Ben Yehuda released the first volume of the resurrected Hebrew language. Now, it's interesting to note that in that same time period, in 1908, the ministry that is now known as Chosen People Ministries was then called the Williamsburg Mission to the Jews, led by Leopold Kohl, an Orthodox Jewish man who came to faith in Christ. And there was a major harvest, the first major harvest of Jewish souls since the time of the early church, in concert with this. Now I ask you, is that a coincidence? Or is God working? Because he's a promise-keeping God. Well, let's talk about prophetic indicator number 2, the dry bones beginning to shake. Surely I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. You see, the dry bones vision is about these bones coming together, and the culmination of that is the breath coming in. This is a picture of the Spirit of God coming in. And in the time of the expulsion from the land, the Jewish people underwent just an enormous amount of persecution. All throughout Europe, the Jewish people were persecuted and displaced. And it finally began to come to a crescendo, these persecutions. They became more and more severe as they went on. And in the 1700s, began what we called the first Aliyah, the first big migration of Jewish people back to the land. And in tandem with that, we began to see the first harvest of Jewish souls. And this really began to take root as we entered into the 1800s, in the late 1800s. As the persecutions increased, ahead of the Holocaust, the Russian pogroms that ran from 1882 to 1918 killed 1.5 million Jewish people and displaced millions of Jewish people. And many of them sought refuge by going back to their ancient homeland, and many of them began to come back to their Messiah, Jesus. So let's talk about prophetic indicator number 3, the return of Jewish believers. So in the 1700s, we began to see notable Jewish people beginning to come to faith. One of the most famous of those was Felix Mendelssohn, who was a famous composer of classical music, and he was one of the earliest Jewish believers in the modern era. Another famous Jewish believer who came in at this time, he was notable Jewish Christian, and his name was Gershom Mendez, and he lived from 1746 to 1816. And he was the first native-born Jewish clergyman in the United States and the first Messianic Jew born in the United States. And he led a congregation called Sheret Israel in New York. Now, this first Zionist Congress in the 1800s began with a guy named Theodore Herzl. In the late 1800s, the persecutions had been so severe for the Jewish people, he saw the only solution for the people was to go back to their ancient homeland. And indeed, 50 years later, the Jewish nation was born again out of the ashes of history. In that time frame, a very famous Jewish believer that I mentioned earlier, Leopold Kohl, who began the first modern Messianic Jewish ministry, Chosen People Ministries, which was followed not long after that by the Messianic Jewish Alliance, which I work for. And we began to see a major harvest of Jewish souls. This continued as we got into the restoration of Israel from 48 all the way up until the 1967 Six-Day War, all the way to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That 6-year period was one of the greatest harvests of Jewish souls in history. And many people worldwide were coming to Christ during that was known as the Jesus movement or the Jesus Freaks movement. But this was one of the greatest harvests of Jewish souls that we'd seen since the time of the early church. And ministries were being born, Jews for Jesus. Keith Green, a famous Christian music artist who helped birth Christian music here in the United States, was a Jewish believer. Messianic Jewish music was being born during that time with a band called Lamb. So let's talk about prophetic indicator number 4, and this is Israel and America, this prophetic connection. The first one I want to highlight to you is Christopher Columbus. A lot of people don't know that Christopher Columbus was Jewish. He would sign his letters with a reference out of Isaiah that many Orthodox Jewish people, but his name in Spanish and in Italian is Colon, which is a variant of the Hebrew word Cohen. Anybody who's got the last name Colon, Cohen, Kuhn, or Khan, the Jewish people regard them as a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses, of the priestly line. The day, August 2nd of 1492, his team was boarding the ship to set sail and find the New World. 300,000 Jewish people were being expelled out of Spain. Many of his crew and his team were Jewish people looking for a safe haven for the Jewish people as they were being forcibly sent out of Spain with only the belongings they could carry on their backs. Now, in the Caribbean, there was an island called St. Eustatius, also known as Statia, and it was a Dutch colony. On that island, there were 100 Jewish families. During the Revolutionary War, these 100 Jewish families were the lifeline for weapons and ammunition for the Continental Army. And if it wasn't for these 100 Jewish families on the island of St. Eustatius, the Revolutionary Army would not have been victorious over the British. When the British found out about it, they took all the men from those families and imprisoned them for the rest of their life. Let's go on, talk about George Washington. George Washington had two right-hand men, Alexander Hamilton, who was the author of the Federalist Papers and the architect of the United States economy and economic system. But he was born to Jewish parents, was orphaned, and became a believer in Jesus Christ. He was a Messianic Jew. George Washington's other right-hand man, Haym Salomon, was an Orthodox Jew, and he was the key financier of the Revolutionary War. And without these two men, Washington probably wouldn't have been able to prevail. Coincidence? You see, the Jewish people were uniquely interconnected to the birth of this nation. And this nation was foundational to the rebirth of Israel because the United States was the first nation to officially recognize the reborn nation of Israel. Do you see the hand of our promise-keeping God? So let's talk about prophetic indicator number 5, a nation born in a day after 2,000 years. There's a big debate today. Whose land is it? Is it the land of Palestine or is it the land of Israel? Does it belong to the Muslims and the Arabs or does it belong to the Jewish people? Well, the answer to that question comes from the Bible itself. God promised the boundaries of Israel, greater Israel, given to us in Genesis 3,973 years ago to Abraham. And these boundaries went from the Euphrates River to the Nile River. That's greater Israel. This is the land deeded, entitled to the Jewish people. Now, under David's kingdom, the next picture over, the land began to move closer to the prophetic boundary that God gave them. And in the middle there is the boundaries of Israel at the time of Jesus. But then in 1948, Israel was born again as a nation. And after the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel came closer to her prophetic boundaries that God gave her than ever before. But then Israel went through a series of giving up land in exchange for the promise of peace. In 67, in the 1990s, in 2005 and 2011. You know this conflict going on in Gaza? Israel unilaterally pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Every Jewish person out of there as a gesture for peace. And what they got from 2005 to the present day, 500,000 rockets launched into their country. Let's talk about prophetic indicator number 6. Israel, the land and the people. The barren land will bloom again. This is a picture of Israel in 1831. And Ezekiel tells us in chapter 33, verse 28, "And I will make the land a desolation and a waste. Her proud might shall come to an end, and the mountains of Israel shall be so desolate that none will pass through." The land was completely desolate, almost completely treeless. It was a barren waste. This is the land in 2025. Amos tells us in chapter 9, verses 14 to 15, that I'll bring back the captives of my people Israel, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. And I will plant them in their land, and they'll never be uprooted again, says the Lord your God. You see, the land and the people together are connected. Israel the land, Israel the people. When they're together, they prosper. When they're apart, they suffer. So here's the contrast. The time of desolation and the time of restoration. Here's the testimony of Mark Twain. Mark Twain went there in 1867 and wrote about this trip in 1881, and he said, "It's a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, wholly given over to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse, a desolation here that not even imagination can grace with pomp of life and action. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere, and even the olive tree and the cactus, those fast friends of worthless soil, had almost deserted the country." This land, Mark Twain's testimony echoes the promise of desolation when the people were absent from the land. Coincidence, or is our God a promise-keeping God? But Zechariah says in chapter 7, verse 14, "I scattered them with a whirlwind among the nations, and they were strangers. The land was left so desolate behind them that no one would come or go. This is how they made the pleasant land desolate." Do you hear Mark Twain's words in that verse? Isaiah 27:6, "In those days Jacob will take root," because she's been planted into the land. "Israel will bud and blossom and fill the world with fruit." Israel is one of the number one exporters and providers of fruit and food products to Europe. and her neighboring countries. This little tiny land that's made the desert blossom. One other thing I want to tell you about is we have a holiday called Tu B'Shvat. Since Israel's been back in the land, we've planted over 400 million trees in the land. It's the only place on planet Earth that's in a reforestation mode. And bees pollinate trees. And the trees came back and the bees came back and the land's beginning to flow with milk and honey, just as it did in the time of Jesus. Promise-keeping God. Prophetic indicator number 7, the church and Israel come together. Here's an interesting verse, Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23. And this says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. In those days, 10 people from all languages and nations shall take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his garment and say, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Now, why does Zechariah say this? And his math is off here. How do you get 10 people from every nation and every language? Because we got a whole lot more than 10 languages and 10 nations, right? But he says 10 people from every language and nation are going to come and grab hold of the Jew by the corner of his garment. That's the talit. What's he talking about here? Well, 10 in the Hebrew mind says something. When we start a new synagogue or a new congregation, you have to have at least 10 adults. We call that a minyan. If you have 10 adults, you have a new congregation. And from 10 on up, it's a complete congregation. But if it dips below 10, it's not a congregation anymore. So he's speaking congregation language. So what's a congregation made up of every tribe, tongue, and nation? That's the church. That's you. The church is going to connect with Israel in the last days for her restoration. And we are seeing that play out even right now. Let's talk about prophetic indicator number 8, Israel in the end times alliance of nations. Zechariah chapter 12 tells us, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem. All the nations of the world are going to come against Jerusalem. And it's going to be taken. And the city's going to be ravaged. And the people are going to be ravaged. And half the city's going to go into captivity. In Zechariah chapter 12, it tells us, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples. And when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem, it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who would heave it away will be cut to pieces, though all the nations of the earth are gathered against it. In verse 10 it says, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me whom they pierced. Who's that? Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. You see, there's this coming time when all the nations of the planet are going to come against Jerusalem. That's never happened in history before. But it is going to happen. And they're going to come to this crisis point where they have nowhere else to turn. Their military might is not going to work. Their allies aren't going to work because all the nations are going to come against her. And the only place they're going to have to look is up. And Jesus Christ is going to intervene in that moment. And they're going to see the one whom they pierced. And all Israel is finally going to recognize that Jesus Christ is in fact the promised Messiah of Israel. Amen? All right. Are we seeing any evidence of that right now? Well, the United Nations... the UN, 167 of the 181 nations, that's 92% of the United Nations, are against Israel, against her existence and against her in resolutions. Since 2015, the UN has issued 151 resolutions against Israel, more than any other nation. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against Israel's prime minister and its defense minister. In 2016, that 1 year period, the UN issued 20 condemnations against Israel. Only one against Iran, one against North Korea, one against China. But 20 against Israel? Another prophetic alignment of nations, Ezekiel mentions in 38 to 39 this conglomeration of nations that's going to come against Israel in the last days. And many prophecy scholars see that comprises Russia, Turkey, Iran, and many believe that includes China also and some other nations. Do we see any evidence of that? Well, we do. China calls for a new security pact with Russia and Iran. The Iran-Russia-China alliance is a nightmare. A Russia-China alliance is emerging, and it's a disaster for the West. And now, this past year, Turkey joined BRICS, which is financial warfare waged by China, Russia, and Iran. It's a financial alliance against the U.S. dollar, and Turkey joined that alliance. Daniel mentions in chapter 11, verse 30, that the ships of Cyprus are going to come to the aid of Israel and go against the king of the north. In some translation it says Kittim, but that in Hebrew means the ships of Cyprus. Well, did you know that Israel and Cyprus have entered a defense pact and a defense treaty to protect one another from Turkey and the threat of Turkey? And Daniel prophesied that, and it's in place now. Let's talk about the army of 200 million from Revelation chapter 9. Now, the number of the army and the horsemen was 200 million. Today, the Chinese Communist Party can mobilize an army of 30 million people in 1 month. In 6 months, they can mobilize an army of over 200 million. And this does not take into account the allied nations that will join into that battle. In World War II, the U.S. was able to mobilize almost 20 million people into its military. For the first time in history, we can see that become a reality. But it doesn't stop there. It tells us in Revelations that the sixth angel poured out his bowl in the great river Euphrates, and the water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. Did you know that the Euphrates River is in the process of drying up, and it's raising alarm bells in the international community? Here's a few articles. Right now, we're within the reality of the Euphrates River completely drying up, and this was prophesied in Scripture. Prophetic indicator number 9, the rebirth of the Caliphate in the Ottoman Turk Empire. Turkey is, last year, 2024, was the 100th anniversary of the fall of the Islamic Caliphate. 100 years ago, after the defeat of the Ottoman Turk Empire in World War I, it had aligned with Germany. In 1918, it was defeated, and then 6 years later, the Caliphate, the Islamic State, collapsed. They have been longing to bring back the Islamic State to rule the Middle East. And Erdogan, the current ruler of Turkey, believes that it's his duty to bring back the Islamic Caliphate and to strengthen the Turkish military in preparation for the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah. Turkey's moving aggressively to reestablish the caliphate. It's moving towards an alliance with Russia and Iran and China. It's moving away from being an ally of Israel to an arch enemy. This week we had Trump telling Israel to take it easy in regards to Turkey, because Turkey's moving its military into Syria. Turkey's moving to take over Syria. It's setting the stage to take over Lebanon, and it's setting the stage to take over Kurdish northern Iraq. And if Turkey were to leave NATO, it's the second largest military in the NATO alliance. Turkey's also taken a military leadership role in Sudan, Somalia, and Libya, which many prophecy scholars regard as being a part of the Ezekiel alliance that comes against Israel. Prophetic indicator number 10, Israel, oil, and the end times battle. So, did you know that Israel is become and is on the way to becoming an energy superpower? Did you know offshore of Israel, the Levant Basin, 245 trillion cubic feet of natural gas has been discovered, 3.2 billion barrels of oil. The Leviathan field, 19 trillion cubic feet of gas, 1.6 billion barrels of oil. The Dalit, Dolphin, Tanin, Karish fields, 40 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and an undetermined amount of oil. Haifa field, 5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and some oil. To the Mar field, 10 trillion cubic feet of gas, 120 million barrels of oil. The Pelagic field, 6.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, 1.4 billion barrels of oil. And they believe that Israel has 250 billion barrels of shale frackable oil onshore. Now, according to a report released in Israel, there was an estimate of recoverable oil possibly as high as 235 million barrels of oil in the Valley of Armageddon. Now, how prophetic is that? Oil in the Valley of Armageddon? Come on. The offshore fields are shared with Cyprus, and it's one of the things that drove the alliance between Israel and Cyprus. Israel is now becoming a key supplier of natural gas because they have enough natural gas to supply them, Europe, and their neighbors for the next 150 years. Russia has used natural gas as leverage over Europe. They were the key supplier to Ukraine, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, Romania, and in the Western Europe, Germany. But Israel now has become one of the key suppliers, taking that leverage away from Russia. Could this be the hook in the jaw that's mentioned that brings Turkey and Russia together against Israel? Could it be? Recently, there have been reports that AFEC Oil and Gas, a subsidiary of the American company Genie Energy, have discovered a bonanza of oil in the Golan Heights with the potential of billions upon billions of barrels of oil. They believe that the output of that area could be as much as 300,000 barrels of oil a day. Here's another article from World Jewish Daily. It says one of the largest deposits of oil, 250 billion barrels of oil in Israel's Shafela Basin, is comparable to Saudi Arabia's entire reserves of 260 billion barrels of oil. Israel now is an emerging energy superpower. Turkey wants control of these energy resources. Russia has been using natural gas as a tool of control over Europe, but now Israel is taking that away from them. Israel has begun to supply Europe with natural gas. Could this be a major player in this coming alliance that Ezekiel foretold? Let's talk about prophetic indicator number 11, Israel, the return of the lost tribes. Over 27 centuries, the first 10 northern tribes of Israel were carried off by the Assyrian Empire, and then Judah and Benjamin were carried off by the Babylonians, and then some of those returned. But most of these people have been scattered among the nations for 27 centuries. CBN ran a really powerful article about the return of the lost tribes as a fulfillment of prophecy. The B'nai Menashe in India, which regard themselves as descendants of Manasseh, the B'nai Israel in India, the B'nai Anasim, the Beta Israel, the Beta Abraham, the Gafat in Ethiopia, the Lemba in Zimbabwe, the Kaifeng Jews in China have all come back, the Yabir Somalian, the Pashtun of Afghanistan. The last Jew last year left Afghanistan and came home to Israel, and the Igbo of Nigeria. They're all coming back. This is prophecy in the fulfillment. Prophetic indicator number 12, the fullness of the Gentiles. Did you know that I believe that the gospel going to every tribe, tongue, and nation is connected to spiritual revival and awakening of Israel. As we move the gospel to every language and nation, we're going to begin to see a greater harvest of Jewish people. Romans 11:25 tells us this. It says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Did you know 99% of the world now has the gospel in their language? There's only 984 language groups left to have the gospel in their language. And according to Wycliffe Bible translators, they're in their last languages project 2025. We could be 3.5 years away from every tribe, tongue, and nation having at least the gospel message in their language for the first time in history. That's a prophetic milestone. Amen? Now, interesting. This is from the front page of the Jerusalem Post. It says, a study, 1/5 of Jewish millennials now believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Today, it's believed that the latest number I looked at today, almost 17 million Jewish people worldwide. And out of that, 1.7 million worldwide are Jewish believers in Jesus. We have not had this many Jewish people believing in Jesus Christ at any other point in history than the early church. The hardening and the blinding is beginning to lift as we're on the eve of the gospel going to every nation and language and the fullness of the Gentiles coming in. Prophetic indicator number 3, the Psalm 83 war and the destruction of Damascus. I believe that Ezekiel 38:11 is tied to the Psalm 83 war because it says in there, you will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, neither having bars nor gates. Here is Israel living in a false illusion of peace. But all the talk of peace, there's not peace because there's a coming assault on Israel that the prophets are telling us of. Psalm 83 describes a war and it lists out these people groups that are compromised, the bordering nations of Israel. All of Israel's bordering nations had historically been enemies of Israel. And just in this last year, we've seen a massive shift in the Middle East. Hamas has been pretty much decimated. The Hezbollah in Lebanon has been pretty much decimated. HTS, the ISIS variant that took over Syria, backed by Erdogan and Turkey, as they were coming in, Israel destroyed the Syrian military infrastructure, completely destroyed it. Right now, the Houthis down in Yemen are being pulverized by Israel and the United States. Jordan has threatened war if the residents of Gaza are pushed to their country against Israel, and Egypt has massed 50,000 troops on the Gaza border and the southern Israeli border in violation of their peace treaty. And tomorrow, President Trump is going to be in direct negotiations with Iran over their nuclear program because they are moments away from having multiple nuclear weapons. And tomorrow's Passover. Isaiah 17 speaks of a coming destruction of Damascus. Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city on the planet. It's never been destroyed. It's been conquered, but never been destroyed. But Isaiah tells us the burden against Damascus, behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The cities of Aroer will be forsaken, and they will be for flocks, and they will lie down, and no one will make them afraid. The fortress will cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. Damascus is going to be destroyed, and Israel is advancing with it. They're just about, I think, 40 miles from Damascus right now, holding that as a buffer, because the leader of Syria now was an ISIS member. He is a radical Muslim who believes in Mahdiism, the coming of the Islamic Messiah. And once he gets his solid footing in Turkey, believe you me, his next goal is going to be Israel. And Israel is going to destroy Damascus. Now let's talk about prophetic indicator number 13, the judgment of Elam in the last days, Jeremiah 49. Jeremiah 49 tells us of this prophecy that and it says in the last days, and Elam is a province in ancient Persia or modern day Iran. That's where in Elam, that province of Elam is where all of Iran's nuclear program is housed. And it tells us there that the Lord, it says, this is what the Lord of armies says, behold, I'm going to break the bow of Elam, the finest of their might. He's going to destroy and pulverize Elam, Iran, and the people are going to scatter to all the nations. And then at the end of it, he says he's going to have his throne. It's the only other place where he says he's going to have his throne besides Jerusalem. He's going to have a throne in Elam, because Elam is the epicenter of the movement to destroy Israel. Let's talk about, last year we saw for the first time in history 2 direct attacks on Israel. Just on the eve of Passover last year, Iran launched cruise missiles, drones, and first-generation ballistic missiles. 99% of those were intercepted and shot down. Then on the eve of Rosh Hashanah in the fall, Iran launched another massive barrage of missiles. This time it was different. It was second and third generation hypersonic ballistic missiles. And most of those were shot down in the atmosphere over Israel, but quite a few of those got through. They didn't hit targets of consequence. But if they would have been capped with a nuclear warhead, it would have been game over, because they detonate those in the upper atmosphere. And they're incredibly hard to shoot down. And it's believed that Iran has a third-generation hypersonic missile that can go 15,000 miles an hour, and we do not have in the United States a system that can shoot it down. All right. So Israel's response to these attacks, they destroyed Iran's air defense systems, their secret undeclared nuke sites, missile factories, missile fuel factories, and communication systems. So they're primed for the finishing off of their nuclear program. Iran has developed Mach 15 hypersonic missiles, and they're on the verge of developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. And if they were to launch one of those at the United States, we would not be able to shoot that down. Iran, it's believed, detonated on October 5th its first underground nuclear test. And Iran is believed to have enough uranium for at least 6 nuclear weapons, maybe more. And Iran wants nuclear weapons to hasten the coming of the Islamic Messiah, the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. Prophetic indicator number 15, where is the U.S. in Bible prophecy? Famed theologian John Walvoord, he said He supposed that the only thing that's restraining God's judgment on America is the presence of the church. If the church were to be removed via the rapture, Walver theorized, that there would be no longer anything to restrain God's judgment on this nation, God's just judgment. This could be a reason that we don't see any mention of the U.S. and end times prophecy. Now, this is just a theory, but I tend to agree with him. There's 15 existential threats to America right now. Hypersonic ballistic missiles. That's why Trump is trying to build a Golden Dome at Manhattan Project style super fast, because we're vulnerable to that. U.S. military bases have been probed by drones, spy balloons. Military base gates have been probed by foreign nationals, a lot from China. Undersea data cable sabotage. There was a Substack article today that says that Russia has a new weapon designed to cut undersea data cables. That carries 98% of the West's communication traffic. There's 2 of those 500 cables, if they were cut, it would bring us to a complete communications halt. The U.S. power grid, CBN ran an article called The Threat of a Cyber Pearl Harbor. When Trump's first presidency, they found a transformer with a kill switch in it that the Chinese Communist Party could switch that transformer off. Trump discovered that there were 200 of these transformers in our grid. He declared a power grid emergency and initiated a ban of these transformers. Biden became president. The second executive order he signed was to remove that ban on Chinese transformers. We now have almost 600 of those in our grid that the Chinese Communist Party could flip off at will. Terror sleeper cells that have crossed the border, and it's believed that as many as 100,000 Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and Afghanistan military-age men have crossed the border. Who are they? Where are they? Why did they come here? I could go on. There's a whole litany of things here. One of the most disturbing is Chinese land purchases around U.S. military installations. This little map up here on the right is a picture of key, very sensitive U.S. military installations that the Chinese Communist Party have bought up thousands and thousands of acres around these installations and put up unauthorized cell towers that could be used as electronic warfare jammers, including the Air Force Base, Offutt Air Force Base, where the Doomsday plane resides for the president. I know a little bit about that. I worked in the White House. Just like Esther, you were born for such a time as this. I don't want to put fear on you tonight. I want to put hope into you. The second coming of Jesus Christ is called the Blessed Hope. You've been put here for such a time as this. And if we're getting close, and I believe we are, to the coming of Jesus Christ, then we have a mission to do with greater intensity and greater fervor than we ever have before, and that is to take the gospel to everybody that we can. Well, that's all I have for you this evening. I'm going to hand it back to Kevin. Okay.
We're going to have a time of question and answer. We want to give you opportunity to try to stump the speaker, if you could.
Stump him.
Yeah, that's all right. Anything we can't answer, I think David's here, right? Where you at, David? David's going to answer.
When I was in the Air Force, after 9/11, I got sent overseas. Then I got sent up to Ramstein Air Base. And one weekend, we ended up going down to Munich. And we had lunch. We went to see the Auschwitz concentration camp just outside of Munich. And then we went to the Marienplatz, which is this big, huge plaza. Gosh, this would have been in 2002. I remember coming around the corner into the Marienplatz, and there must have been 100,000 Muslims there. And they had a big stage, and they had these murals of all these cities around the world, Rome, Jerusalem, London, New York, that were being taken over by Islam. And they had a speaker up there, and I didn't understand what they were saying, but I filmed this thing. This is all the way back in 2002. There's been a move to place Muslims all throughout the West, and I believe that they're here as sleeper cells. There's a former CIA operative that raised an alarm about a possible attack by ISIS-affiliated terrorists. You know, last year, the Border Patrol caught 100 ISIS operatives at the border, and 92 of them, our new Homeland Security director said 92 of them were released back into the populace. Nobody knows where they are. These are the most radical jihadists around. And I'm deeply, deeply concerned by the sheer number. And the numbers that we have are just the ones that we've known. What about the ones that we didn't see? It's a very alarming and concerning thing. But could it be that this is a part of prophecy playing out. And it's all the more reason for us to be very intentional about sharing the gospel with people. Jesus Christ is the hope in all circumstances. Any other questions? I worked in the White House in White House communications under Bush, and worked directly with Secret Service and National Security Council people. So we had people who had ties with Iran and other terror groups that had security clearances. It's just mind-blowing to me. Any other questions?
Why were the Chinese allowed to build those installations around our...
That's the million-dollar question. Why were they allowed to put up non-authorized by the FCC cellular towers and buy this land around Offutt Air Force Base, farmland all around the base, and that base is ringed by Chinese-owned cell towers and equipment. And that base is extremely sensitive because the Doomsday plane. Air Force One is not the Doomsday plane. That's like when 9/11 happened and they took President Bush to Nebraska. They didn't know what was unfolding. They were taking him to the Doomsday plane because that's a whole nother level of aircraft. And that base, that super sensitive base, is ringed by Chinese-owned equipment. And this has been reported on things like Fox News. This is in the public domain now. And it's very alarming and concerning. And there was a hack of our cell systems. T-Mobile and Verizon were hit really hard with a hack. And it was through Chinese-made equipment routers. And for an entire day, about 2/3 of those carriers last year were not able to communicate, including my phone. And that was just a test. They have a hacking group called Salt Typhoon. So through this cell equipment, they can use what they call electronic warfare, jamming, and they can jam signals. It's very serious.
Can you say something else about the drones and the air bases? You remember when all the stuff was going on?
Trump made a comment that the drones were ours, but not all of them were. There was an episode out at Vandenberg Air Force Base. The Chinese national was arrested operating a drone that was watching a SpaceX rocket launch that was carrying sensitive U.S. military satellite equipment. Langley Air Force Base over a year ago had a series of drones that were flying at sundown at dusk. They were coming from out in the ocean, flying over the F-22 hangars. That's where most of the F-22s are based, and lingering. And military personnel were alarmed. The thing is this airspace over military installations are part of a MOA. This is military aircraft authorized airspace. And to have drones that aren't authorized coming in it's an in-flight hazard. You can have a drone strike just like you can have a bird strike in an engine. You can have a drone strike and cause an airplane crash. And so there are a number of instances where the drones suspected to be operated by either transnational terrorist groups or the Chinese or the Iranians running rampant over very sensitive installations, not just military installations, but nuclear power plants, key electrical facilities. It's another very concerning thing that's going on right now.
I was just wondering why our government is not responding to this. Like, why aren't they shooting them?
Well, since Trump has come into office, there's been a rapid response to create a missile shield, to address Trump has redeclared a power grid emergency, re-signed a new executive order banning Chinese transformers, Chinese telecoms equipment, and they're also moving to create a ban on Chinese land purchases. A lot of states are moving that direction to ban Chinese land purchases. Up in Montana, the state blocked the Chinese from buying land adjacent to some of our nuclear missile bases up there. In the slide set, I had 15 things in there, but there's much more than that I could share with you tonight. But there's so many things that need to be addressed. One of the biggest is the undersea data cables. We have 500 of those that cross the ocean floor, and beginning in the summertime last year, Russia and China began cutting these data cables. One of the things that really raised my concernometer was Russia and China did a military exercise where they took the RUNet, which is the Russian internet, off the gig, the global information grid, and to see if they could continue to talk between themselves, China and Iran. And I believe this was an exercise to see if these data cables were cut and the West was brought to its knees communication-wise. And it's not just that. They have dogfighting satellites that they've launched, weaponized satellites that are designed to take out. So 98% of our comms goes on these undersea data cables. There's two of those. If they were cut, GPS would be down, command and control systems would be down, the ability for weapons guidance would be down. And in the remaining 2%, what goes over the satellite constellations, if they've weaponized satellites, taking out key satellites, now they have the ability to take out all of our ability for communications, command, and control. Knock out our power grid with Cyber Pearl Harbor. A lot of people don't realize how grave a situation we could be in. And the Trump administration is working overtime to address these things, which is a relief to me. But the problem is, a lot of these problems take some time. You can't just build a transformer. It takes a while to build those, and a lot of our infrastructure to do that has been shipped overseas. That's why we were buying Chinese ones. Any other questions? I really don't know. I've heard theories of that. Is he going to be from the revived Roman Empire? Is he going to be Russian? Is he going to be Turkish? Is he going to be Islamic? Is he going to be Jewish? I don't know the answer to that question. I definitely think it's one of a plausible scenario. That's just a hard one to say. I don't know when Jesus Christ is coming back, but I believe it's soon. And if it is soon, then he could be alive. And one of the things you'll find out later is during the tribulation, the Antichrist will reveal himself at the mid part of tribulation because he's going to go into the third temple and declare that he's God. And one of the things we'll be talking about is all the preparations for the third temple, which are really shocking. And we're going to have a lot of photos and go over that. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's plausible.
I've always had the question about how the United States fits into the end times.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do. Because when the Bible was written and Revelation was written, the United States didn't exist. I don't really understand really what America's role is in the end, other than helping Israel and being a friend of Israel. But from a military standpoint and the 10 nations and all, I've always wondered.
The United States really stands as kind of the last roadblock. It's the only thing that's kept the UN from doing really bad damage to Israel. Obviously, the land, and there'll be people here. Will it still be a viable government? Would it still be a major player? I don't know that that's the case, but it could be. There's a lot of theologians that have surmised that maybe it isn't. It's dethroned as the world power. And we're certainly well down that road for that to happen. And so that could be a plausible scenario that plays out. And that's why I brought up all of these things, that it could happen. And if it does, it just facilitates the rise of these alliances and these nations that in the world coming against Israel, because the only thing that's blocking the United Nations from going hard against Israel is the United States.
Where does AI stand in all this?
That's a really good question. The Chinese are ahead of us in AI. I actually know some people who are top guys in AI, and they have the advantage over us right now. When I was in Iraq, we were there in 07 and 08, I got to see a lot of DARPA robots, that they would send into rooms. Some of them looked like little dogs, and some of these things could vertically jump 2 stories to get onto a roof. And now they're looking at AI-driven robot technology for the battlefield. And we're coming into a whole new era. The U.S. has lost its qualitative edge. We still have incredible weapons and systems, but we're behind the power curve. And that facilitate the Antichrist being able to control everybody buying and selling globally. That infrastructure is on the way, and AI will only enhance that.
I grew up in a Jewish house, and it was, when I became a believer, it was
Baruch Hashem.
very difficult in my family. I thought I was going to be disowned, but over the years I was able to talk about Christ with my mom and dad and brother and sister. And so it's great refreshing to hear a fellow Jew, another Christian.
And, and he's a part of this miracle of God's promise that the Jewish people are coming back to faith in Jesus Christ globally, and even within Israel. You're a living emblem of our promise-keeping God and his word.
Thank you.
Yes.
My other question is, I recently retired as an airline pilot, so I was able to fly with a lot of guys who were generals and officers. And so we talked a lot about what the country does to prepare for like a cyber attack or the grid going down. And they gamed it a lot, apparently, a lot of the guys that I talked to. So when you were talking about the transformers, the Chi-Com transformers, that was very, made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And one of the scenarios, they talked about, well, if these nations surrounding Israel, they attack Israel. So at that moment, they shut our grid down, and it becomes so bad here. They gamed it where they said maybe about over half the population would die within 5 to 6 months.
So 2008 and 2012, there was a congressional report done. And in that report, that study that was commissioned, they found that if there was an EMP strike on the grid, and it took out the grid or a greater part of the grid, in that scenario, that within 1 year, 90% of the U.S. population would be dead, because it would be an unrecoverable situation.
The question is, so one of the things we talked about, well, at that moment, Israel's going to need help, our help, and they can't do it. What are our troops going to say? We're going to go fight for Israel, but we're not going to come home to nothing.
Yeah.
So they're going to bring everybody back. Israel's going to ask for help, and they say, well, we can't do it because we're not going to have a country left if we don't get home and take care of it. Seemed like that was one of the scenarios that they were talking about.
After the October 7th attacks, the United States heavily aided Israel, but as the war drug on in Gaza and pressure began to mount, there was a threat of withholding munitions that Israel needed. And that raised alarms because Israel is so heavily dependent on the United States for weaponry and munitions and parts. You're flying all these sorties with aircraft. You've got to have resupply of parts and bench stock of things that you need to keep these aircraft maintained. Otherwise, you're going to have to begin to cannibalize other aircraft and other weapon systems. And so I think what you said is very much.
There are still people in the government that are heavily compromised by the Chi-Com still. I want to say the deep state, but just the administrative state.
I do think that that's the case. I think that that's trying to be remedied at warp speed. But the scope and the scale of compromise is just jaw-dropping. It's like we have not one Trojan horse inside the boundaries of our country, but we've got 10,000 of them. And a rack and stack, which are the priorities. But the power grid's a really big deal because military equipment's hardened against EMP, but nobody really factored in. These bases are dependent on the civilian power grid infrastructure. Now, they used to have coal-fired power plants that they could run the base power grid even if the civilian grid went down, but a lot of those have been dismantled and they don't have that infrastructure. And they have generators, but once the fuel runs out, and it's even thought that some of these generators that have parts and components that have come from China may be compromised too.
Number one, thank you for what you do.
Thank you, sir.
This is cool.
Question you answered for me over lunch, but I think it'd be helpful to people to know how you are Jewish with a very Gentile name and came to know Christ.
My birth father, Stephen Zerrett, was Jewish. My mom was also part Jewish, part Irish. When I was 5 years old, I was adopted by a Gentile person, Warren Van Landaghem, and that's where I get the Belgian last name. But that was really what put me on the path to coming to know the Lord. My dad's best friend, his son, he got saved in a Calvary Chapel church, and he was the first person to share the gospel with me when I was 18 years old and became a believer. And then it was kind of a process of coming back to my Jewish roots and a call to Israel ministry. I had a call to ministry right away, and that began to play out. But Jewish ministry was something that kind of evolved. So my birth father was Jewish, my mom was part Jewish, and adopted by a Belgian Gentile from St. Louis, Missouri. So God works in ways that I'm grateful, because if it wasn't for that, I don't know that I would be a believer right now, talking to you right now. So.
All right. I'm going to ask the last question unless somebody else got one. Tomorrow, Passover, Trump, people from Iran. What do you see coming from that, and what?
It's interesting. One of the things we're going to talk about are the biblical holidays tomorrow and how they relate to Jesus Christ first and his second coming, but really focusing in on his second coming because they're related to both. And if you look at all these huge historic events, October 7th, 2023, that day was the end of Feast of Tabernacles, the seventh biblical holiday, a day called Simchat Torah, rejoicing in the Word. That attack happened on that day. The Iranian missile attack happened just before Passover 2024. And the second one was on the eve of Rosh Hashanah of 2024. It's interesting, Joe Biden built a pier off of Gaza to circumvent the Israelis and supply Gaza, which the Israelis were opposed to because Hamas is taking all the humanitarian aid and feeding their army and starving the population. So Biden built this pier, and the day that the pier broke up, this $300 million pier, was a day called Lag BaOmer, another Jewish holiday, which is the 33rd day between Passover and Shavuot, another biblical holiday that comes 50 days later. And so if you're looking at the prophetic calendar, you see God working in relation to Israel. Israel's being born again as a nation in conjunction with Shavuot. And that's because these biblical holidays are related to the restoration of Israel, but really are related to the second coming of Jesus Christ, just like they were to the first coming of Jesus Christ. And so tomorrow, Trump is negotiating with Iran, and tomorrow is Passover. Is that a coincidence? Maybe it is. I think it's significant. And Israel is full tilt in preparation for the third temple, and remarkable. And one of the last things that they need to do, they may do in preparation for the third temple tomorrow. It remains to be seen, and you'll hear about that on Sunday. So
We'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 9, and I'm telling you, every session builds on the other one until Sunday when he talks about some things that David and I got to see in Israel, and even things that have happened since we were there. I mean, that was just 2017, so it'll be an exciting time. God bless you. Thank you for being here, and thank Ted for being here. Yep.